Casey stumbled backward as the python flew across the ground toward him, fast as lightning. It came to a halt on the rocky ground, gravel spraying and hissed. Casey's eyes widened. Then he lowered his brows angrily. "You!" He recognized the python. It had the exact same markings as the one that had attacked him when he first arrived in this high mountain valley. How long ago was that? Months at least. Not only had he spent ages as Arthur's captive, but he'd been deep in a meditative state fighting the poison for just as long. For all he knew, he'd lost an entire year of his life because this python had alerted Arthur to his presence. "This is your fault." Casey pointed his finger at the snake angrily. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been in this cave for so long, you rat!" Suddenly, all the anger and frustration he'd been burying deep in his belly for weeks rose to the surface. It seemed as though this stupid snake was the cause of all his problems. Casey planted his feet and clenched his fists. His fingers dug into his palms as he seethed. Wild green magic began to flow out of his fists like curls of smoke licking the air. "Come and get me," Casey snapped. The snake hunched its thick, meaty body and let out a venomous hiss that echoed across the valley. Casey set his teeth as the snake darted toward him. He lifted his hands to block its advance. As he flattened his palms, glowing magic swirled and crackled, rolling through his fingers. Without understanding how he did it, Casey let loose a stream of poisonous gas that shot straight toward the python's head. With an eerie scream, the giant snake landed on the rocks about a foot away, bouncing back as though it had struck a wall. Casey waited, his heart pounding, anxious to see if he'd killed it. He rubbed his palms together, and weak sparks flew. Had he used up all of his magic? He shook his fingers, trying to drum up some power. The snake stirred and raised its scaly head. Hiss! With supernatural speed, the snake launched itself over the rocks again. Unable to replicate the poison gas, Casey stumbled backwards, flinging up his hands as he searched desperately for some magical reserves. But there was nothing. Then, as his back hit the cave floor painfully, a calm came over him. Time slowed down. The snake grew closer. Casey released his breath and drew on the poison magic that he had cultivated in his spirit. His whisper was loud to his own ears. "Come on, spirit sword." He raised his hand over his head, summoning the spell with his poison magic. Then he brought his hand down like a knife. A green arc of light flew out of his hand straight for the python. The spirit sword sliced the snake in half with a shower of glowing green embers. The snake fell to the ground, releasing a quiet hiss, then was still. Casey sat up slowly and wiped sweat from his forehead. He staggered over to the snake and knelt down beside it. Its body was quiet and still. Casey slumped. A troubling sadness filled him. This was a hollow victory. The python had wanted to kill him. He was sure of it. And he had to defend himself. But if it weren't for this snake, he may never have met Arthur, the man who had held him captive, but who had also given him great power. Casey stroked the snake's cold scales thoughtfully as he thought about the old man. Arthur had taught him that sometimes things are not what they seem at first glance. Maybe the snake wasn't exactly his enemy. Maybe it was just doing what creatures do. Casey stood and looked around the walls of the high mountain valley. The weak sunlight was fading, and it would soon be night. He couldn't wait until morning. He had to leave. Now. He couldn't linger by Arthur's grave any longer. He had to go and find the 7 deadly poisons, learn to cultivate magic, and keep his promise to Arthur. After all, the old man had given him a purpose, something he was sorely lacking in his old life working at the plant. It was time to strike out on his own. He had little to take with him except for the herbs and potions he had carefully stowed away inside the Golden Tower of Light. That and Arthur's magical black robe. Casey scratched his head and turned in place, his brow furrowing as he looked for a sign. He wasn't sure which way to go. The sun was failing. He had to make a decision. He turned and started walking up the mountainside toward what he thought was the east. He looked over his shoulder once. Goodbye, Toxic Gate. Goodbye, Arthur. It was an endless night. Casey journeyed up the mountainside, walking until his feet were raw. At last, the air changed. Gone was the stink of sulfuric poison. Instead, the air was clear and sweet. Casey breathed in deeply as the sun rose above the horizon and washed the land with streaks of gold. Lush, green forest stretched as far as Casey could see. The trees were tall and lush, the leaves green and glistening with morning dew. He sighed as he walked through the woods. Being away from Arthur's cave left him with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. He reached out a hand and brushed the leaves of a nearby tree with his fingertips. The cool, smooth touch of each leaf was like balm to his soul after so many months staring at nothing but the rocky walls of Arthur's cave. I had to trust my instincts. He scratched his nose lazily and yawned. They led me here. Maybe they're touched by magic too. Whoosh! Something brushed Casey's face, whizzing by without any warning. He snapped his head back and yelped. His eyes widened as a glowing sword thunked into the tree trunk beside him. As he watched, the sword melted away into thin air. A spirit sword? Casey flattened himself against the tree, a cold sweat making him shiver. Where there was one magic sword, there might be others. He had to be careful. He peered around the forest, trying to find the source of the magic. Raised voices drew his attention. With great caution, he crept through the woods toward the sound, clenching his fist to summon some magic of his own, just in case. As he came closer to the source of the ruckus, the ringing of clashing swords reached his ears. He eased around the trunk of a large tree to get a better look. The scene before him was chaos. The trees surrounding the small clearing had been destroyed. Branches hung brokenly, and leaves and pieces of bark were strewn all over the grass. A man and a woman stood in the center of the clearing with magic swords drawn. Casey was drawn to the woman. She had long, black hair. Her magic shone faintly blue, and her sword flickered, as though she wasn't very strong, but the look on her face was pure determination. The man circled her, stepping lightly to the side. "You're coming home with me, Lucy. You were promised to me." Lucy lifted her chin, and her sword magic brightened. "I never agreed to marry you, Miguel." Casey narrowed his eyes. Maybe he shouldn't get into the middle of some kind of lover's quarrel. He hung back, but his interest was piqued. He wanted to know what had sparked such a vicious argument between a man and his bride. Lucy raised her hand, and her sword angled toward Miguel. "I mean it. I'm not going home. Not with you." Miguel sneered. "With who, then? If you're waiting for your lover, he's not coming." Her shoulders drooped for a moment. "What do you mean?" Miguel spat. "I know about him. Your father knows too. He sent west unto the underworld with his very own sword this morning." Lucy cried out. "No, you're lying." Lucy raised her voice in a wordless scream. Miguel's satisfied laughter made the hair on Casey's arms stand on end. As Casey watched in horror, Lucy darted toward the man, her hands turning to fists, as though she would punch him herself with her own bare hands. Above her head, her sword magic flickered and almost went out. Miguel roared with laughter. You dare? Very well then. Test the bounds of my mercy, Lucy. I'll have you as my wife, or not at all. Casey's blood went cold, and he snarled in disgust. At his side, his hand flashed with poison magic. No way was this man going to attack Lucy. Not on Casey's watch. Idiot! Casey fumed as he started out from behind the tree. Just as Casey was about to leap between Lucy and Miguel to intervene, a man stumbled into the clearing. He was tall, with a thin face and regal-looking clothes. And to Casey's dismay, the man was covered in blood.